Well, here we are, and this is an introduction to the tax lab at the college. And place I've spent a lot of time in. It's pretty cool, and it attracts sort of the geekiness of geeks, some of which you would know. So there's two things we do. One are mounts that are meant to look realistic, and this was one of the earliest ones ever created at the college, and this is one of the more recent ones done by our very own Truth Mueller, who did a brilliant job on it for his first attempt at doing a mount. And then the rest are study skins, and study skins are not meant to look realistic. They're meant so that you can pick them up and study them. So if you're interested in plumages or really want to look at something very detailed, you can just pick it up and examine it. So they're positioned in a matter that is for convenience, and so that they stack well in the cabinet cases. And so I thought we'd just go around and give a brief talk about them. One of the things that is cool about birds is you can see a bird you've never seen in your life, but you can make some conclusions about what it does for a living by its morphological parts. And so we'll look at some feet, some beaks, and size differences. So Rich and I are literally winging it. So we're just going to kind of ad-lib as we go along.
As we always do.
As we always do. So I wanted to point out this bird was collected by Nathan, who's our TA, and done by Jasper White just recently. And so this was collected off of, I believe, Mount Desert Rock, although I have the wrong glasses on. And this is an immature blackback gull, and this one here is a mature herring gull. And so I just wanted to show you the size differences. These are the two common gulls around here, and even a young blackback is quite a bit larger than a mature herring gull.
I'm just going to pull this aside, Scott. As you're showing those two gulls, it's worth, and I think it will show up in the video here, just you can see the plumage difference in the wings. The blackback gull, as Scott says, is immature, but the real difference here is the bill. Look at the size of the bill here of the herring gull and the size of the bill of the great blackback gull, and also the length. The great blackback gull has got a much bigger bill, more powerful, and I have experience with these things and how powerful they are. They've certainly bitten me many times in my studies.
Yeah, they can be quite ferocious, particularly if you're trying to band them.
Yes.
Since we're talking about bills, maybe we should skip down to the crow and raven.
Sure. Let's hold these and bring them right up to the camera.
So you can see the ravens are a bigger bird than crows. They look very similar, and so if you see one far away, you can get confused. But there's a couple of features, and you know how things get smaller as they get further away. So ravens have a much more massive bill and a more curved tail. And I'm particularly fond of crows and ravens. They're very clever birds.
The raven is the one on the top. This is the crow on the bottom. Raven bill on the top. Actually, on the bottom, crow bill on the top. And Scott mentioned the raven having more massive bill. It also, look at on the bill, there's these called nasal nares. I'm going to bring this even closer. The feathers on the bill of the raven really extend much further out than they do on the crow.
Which is a feature that's hard to see if they're far away. One thing I learned, we have a local zoo, and I went to pick up some things once, and they had a pair of ravens that they were full grown when they got them back in the 1960s. And this was 2000 and something. and they were massive. And so ravens, I think, just keep growing their whole life. They looked like they were out of friggin' Narnia. I mean, they were just like huge.
I want to, since we're talking about crows and ravens, I want to just pick up this crow here for a minute. And I have people on my tours that are from other states, usually further south or south and west. They'll say all the time, like, I was out the other day and I saw so many ravens. I'm like, you didn't see so many ravens, you saw a lot of crows. Like, no, these things were massive. And if you haven't taken ecology, you would learn it there, but there's something called Bergmann's rule. And I know, Scott, you've talked about Bergmann's rule in ornithology in other years. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about Bergmann's rule and how that applies, like using crows maybe as an example?
So there's a phenomena where critters, not just birds, but that the cooler the temperatures and the damper the conditions, it leads to individuals being larger versus if they're in a warm, dry environment. So if you take things like things that are more cosmopolitan, have a really wide spread, crows are much smaller down south, coyotes, all manner of robins, and then as you go further north up into Newfoundland and Canada, or on the west coast, they get larger and larger. So size does matter, and that one of the recent studies that we're going to make you read is showing how birds across the spectrum within a number of species are actually getting smaller with climate change. Yep. So conditions do affect size.
And I think part of Bergmann's rule is that, as you were saying, the further north you go in species range, or the colder the climate, the bigger they get. And so part of that is when you're bigger, you have more mass. More mass means more thermal mass. It's easier to retain heat. Conversely, where it's warmer, and if you're smaller, you have less thermal mass, and you're able to dissipate heat more quickly.
Should we go around randomly?
Yeah.
We'll switch sides.
All right.
Except where's mine?
What do you need, Scott?
So we're going to mostly talk about the tax lab, but also feathers today. And so I just wanted to show you this cormorant, which is the most handled bird in the collection, and it's because it was done by Scott Swan in 1983.
Do you know him?
And this was done as punishment. I committed a no-no. So they brought out this cormorant, and it was nasty. It had been washed dead on the beaches of Florida for several days, been driven over by a beach buggy, and it was just a mess. And so they wanted it because it's a subspecies, and it's an olivaceous cormorant that's you find further south. And so they really wanted it for the collection, so they gave it to me to contend with. And I like the fact that 83, how many years ago was that?
It was a long time ago.
A long time ago.
Probably before most of you were born.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's the cormorant that, because I did it, they bring it to like schools when they have to give presentations, and little kids, use it like a gun, and it gets handled a lot. And it's held up through the test of time. So I was going to use it, and so this is a cormorant that you would find around here. And so what makes an olivaceous cormorant is the total length. And so, but we're looking at this smashed, flattened specimen. It was just hard to figure out what the length was. And so we got the ornithologist Bill Drury down to look at it, to identify it. And he kind of didn't get too close to it, but he kind of looked at it and he goes, well, what's the minimum cutoff? And we came up with, some measurement that would make it a subspecies, the olivaceous, and Bill just looked at me and said, well, you're the taxidermist. You can make it any length you want. And so I made it into an olivaceous cormorant. And one of the things that we'll talk about is I wanted to show you, hold it up close, how waterproof birds are. And so one of the things that feathers do is keep you dry. So one layer of feathers acts as basically a dry suit that not just in water birds, in all birds, that even during rainy days, they can stay pretty dry.
That, you're mentioning the birds staying dry, and that's just really fascinating to me. I remember being a little kid watching mallards at my local park, and how they'd come up and water would just roll off their feathers.
Yeah, no.
And with the cormorant, there's a little bit different, because I want to say all birds, but certainly most North American birds have an oil gland that they use, and you'll see birds constantly preening their feathers, straightening their feathers, but they're also taking oil from the oil gland to waterproof them. And in another lecture, I'll talk about cormorants at length, but cormorants are a controversial bird, and people have said for years, among the things about cormorants, like, their feathers are not waterproof. Well, they're just not as waterproof as a bird like an eider, but they're definitely waterproof. They have an oil gland, it's just an underdeveloped oil gland. Anyway, go ahead, Scott.
Let's talk about
One of my favorites.
snowy owls.
We're gonna talk about Hedwig.
Hedwig. We had one particularly clever student who figured out that there were actually 7 Hedwigs in the Harry Potter series.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so these are, we'll talk a little bit more about seasonality. One of the things I love about this place is that we get all these Arctic birds in the wintertime. And they migrate south to warm and tropical Bar Harbor, Maine, or Mount Desert Island. I always find it interesting because if I was going to migrate south, I'd want to find a warm tropical beach that served margaritas. And these guys, they migrate south, but you find them on the top of Cadillac and Sargent, the most inhospitable places, and the Bar Harbor Airport.
Yeah.
Somehow they can figure out that airports are predator-free, and so they hang out there a lot. What's next?
What's next?
So again, it's feathers.
Yeah.
And feathers have a real practical application. And one of the things that always amazes me, I can be a little facetious sometimes. Like when God made Mola Molas, he was obviously on crack cocaine because he got the head done and then he just like forgot to do the rest of the body. When he invented feathers, he got it right the first time. You look at the most ancestral feathers and they're pretty much identical to the ones you find today. And feathers do a lot of different things. One, they make you waterproof. 2, they keep you insulated. But they also can identify you as a male or female. And so this is an extreme example of sexual dimorphism. So these are eider ducks, where you get eider down from. And with the ducks, in general, you get a lot of sexual dimorphism. And there's a correlation between sexual dimorphism and the role the male plays. And the more sexual dimorphism you exhibit as a male, your contribution to the breeding cycle is less and less, brief. And so with eiders, they mate, and then the female does everything, sits on the males just take off, and females incubate the eggs, hatch the chicks, and then defend them until they're grown up.
I wanted to mention, since we're looking at these study skins here, just briefly about color. Color is a lesson. People, you talk about the color of the birds. You know, what color is the gannet? Well, it's white, except the head. Let's see if we can get close. there's a nice yellow wash to the head. The eider, the male, is black and white, people would say. Except you get close, again, there's this kind of greenish wash, especially about the back of the head. And then look at the body here. Is that black? It's actually, I would say it's not black. It's more like dark brown, shades of brown. So what we call black is really very few birds in the bird world have pure black. At least, maybe certainly in North America, there's very few that are pure black. Even the loon, you know, at a distance, the loon, you've got the black head, but you get close and you can see there's actually subtle brown, very dark brown, but it's not pure black. Certainly not the body that's speckled with white.
I'm sure the feet.
Oh,
And so again, body parts tell you a lot about the bird, and webbed feet means they're aquatic, that they go swimming.
so since we talked about the feet of the loon, we just showed you the webbed feet of the loon. Actually, I'm going to show that one more time. Look at the feet. See how many toes you can see here. There's 1 toe, 2 toes, 3 toes, and a 4th toe is kind of diminutive, yes. And so very spread out, wide feet. They can make them wide. Excellent swimmers. Let's look at the feet of the cormorant. Thank you. Also, feet evolved for swimming, but look at the shape. It's very different. There's the 1, 2, 3, 4 toes. The webbing between all 4 toes is much more prominent, but it's also a little bit less overall surface area. So this is, in cormorants, we say their feet are toady-palmate, meaning all 4 toes have webbing and they're all forward. Now compare that to the osprey, and look at the difference in feet here. The osprey's got these long nails, curved. I'm going to put the cormorant down. Here he is. The toes here, the fleshy part of the toe, is actually, it's almost like sandpaper. It's really good for gripping. These talons curve in, so when they grab a fish, once they've got that fish, it's pretty rare that the fish gets out of their talons. When they're diving, they only have about a 60% success rate at actually getting their prey, but once they got it, they've got it.
And
What should we show them for feet?
we did get it.
Yeah, let's look at gannet too. Gannet is in the Sulidae. Actually, they've changed Sulidae. I don't think it's Sulidae anymore. I think it's.
It's so hard to keep up.
I know. I think it's They're in the order Pelecaniformes, and the family. That might be Sulidae, but they keep changing these things, and it's hard to keep.
Genetics, because you have to relearn everything.
So another webbed foot, because the gannet will plunge dive. They'll dive from great height into the water. Great height meaning 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 feet high.
Very dramatic to watch.
Yes, they plunge dive straight down to the water, hit the water. At the last second, this gannet is not a good illustration for this case. At the last second, they take their wings and actually drop their wings back. So they are total spear going to the water. When you're dropping from 100 feet, you don't want your wings, even here, there's a shoulder that's going to hurt. So it's almost like they dislocate them. They really spread them straight back. And then once they're in the water, they can fly with their wings and with their feet underwater. And in the case of the gannet, scientists at Memorial University in Newfoundland have used time depth recorders and found that these guys can go as deep as 120 feet. Typically, their dives more like in the 40 to 60 foot range.
It's worth going out to Mount Desert Rock just to watch these guys. It's really, really fun.
Oh, here's a fun one.
Here, you hold it up, I'll tell the story of that. So, we told you not to use Great Antilles Peterson Guide because a number of reasons, but one of the big ones is range change. And so, what year was that collected?
1975 in Seal Harbor.
So, one of the things that's changed dramatically is that back when New England was pretty much in farming, my grandparents are farmers, and one of the things they do is shoot everything. So they shoot birds of prey because of their chickens, and they include vultures in that category, even though vultures don't really kill things. And so they were hunted to extinction in New England. And then in the 60s, they started coming back. And so this was the first one to return, to get up to Maine, and somebody shot it. And so it ended up in our collection. And some of our tags have little red spots on them, and it just means that it's a very special specimen. So this is the first turkey vulture to return to Maine.
That's cool. It's interesting you mentioned that. I know in 1975, if that was flying around Bar Harbor, birders would have been ecstatic to come and see it from all over Maine.
Yeah, I remember we had a flocks, a kettle.
A kettle, yeah.
Of 7, when I was a student here, there was a flock of 7 turkey vultures that flew over the island, and it made the newspapers, and it was like a big deal.
Yeah.
And now I've probably seen hundreds already.
Scott mentioned that, is it a flock, is it a kettle? In birds, more than just about any other grouping of species, I realize I'm not in the view here. In birds, there are all kinds of collective nouns that are really colorful, and you probably know a few. Flock is a collective noun, kettle for any raptor, crows.
What do you call a loose aggregation of loons in the winter?
Oh, I don't know.
I don't know either.
Oh, I'll have to look it up. Crows, it's a murder of crows. You get a bunch of crows. And actually, I saw something really funny on Facebook recently. There was a picture of 2 crows, and somebody called it an attempted murder. So. Right. Should we pause this here, Scott?
Yeah.
And get ready for the next one?
Yeah. Oh, do we want to talk about peels?